The unspoken verdict, how Hitler's generals knew the war was lost long before the end. It is a date seared into the collective memory of the world, May 8, 1945, VE Day, the official end of the war in Europe, a moment of global catharsis marked by triumphant allies and a Germany reduced to ash and rubble. Yet to fix the moment of defeat on that day is to fundamentally misunderstand the Second World War as experienced by its most capable protagonists, the senior officers of the German Wehrmacht. For them, the war did not end with a single spectacular act of surrender. It ended in a series of chilling, incremental realizations, each a nail driven into the coffin of the Third Reich's delusion of perpetual victory, which began years before the final desperate collapse. This is the story of those generals, the inheritors of the Prussian military tradition, who, despite their brilliance in the execution of blitzkrieg, found themselves trapped in a slow-motion catastrophe dictated by a high command that had traded strategic realism for messianic fanaticism. This is the story of the unspoken verdict delivered in the cold light of a Russian winter, confirmed by the rumble of American bombers and sealed by the very Führer they had sworn to serve. Part 1. The Mirage Shatters. Autumn 1941 to winter 1942. The delusion of swift victory was intoxicating. By the autumn of 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, had swallowed staggering tracts of enemy territory. Army Group Center, the central pivot of the German invasion, was within a hair's breadth of Moscow. The world watched in awe and terror. Yet, in the closed, map-strewn offices of the Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH, the German Army High Command, a profound and sickening realization was beginning to dawn. The men responsible for the logistics and deployment of the German war machine saw something the propaganda machine did not. The Soviet Union was not France, and the German army was bleeding to death. Franz Halder's Ledger of Despair, August 1941. Generaloberst Franz Halder, the chief of the OKH General Staff, was the quintessential Prussian officer, meticulous, brilliant, and, critically, a man of numbers. His diary, usually a dry record of deployments and logistics, became, in late 1941, a chronicle of mounting dread. In August, a full 4 months before the catastrophic Soviet counteroffensive, Halder jotted down a note that would chill the blood of any military historian. We underestimated Russia. We reckoned with 200 divisions. Now we have already counted 360. This single entry was the first definitive mathematical proof of failure. The premise of blitzkrieg was a quick, decisive campaign that would shatter the enemy's will and organizational capacity before their vast potential could be mobilized. Halder's tally meant that the Soviets had a seemingly bottomless well of manpower, an industrial base far more resilient than anticipated, and a depth of space that rendered every German advance a logistical nightmare. Every tank lost, every man frozen was a permanent depletion. For the Soviets, every lost division was simply a new number on the ledger, a new formation pulled from the limitless reserves of the East. The generals of the Eastern Front understood the chilling implication. Germany was losing the war of attrition. They had not planned for a long war, especially not one in the East. Their logistical tails were stretched to the breaking point, their equipment freezing in temperatures for which it was never designed, and the vaunted superiority of the German soldier was dissolving in the mud and snow. The December pivot, the gates of Moscow. The winter of 1941 to 42 was the crucible of this early realization. The final desperate lunge at Moscow failed, not just because of the weather, but because the Wehrmacht was exhausted. Then came the shock, the Soviet counteroffensive. Hitler, in a move that appalled and alienated his professional commanders, issued the infamous Stand Fast order. Generals, steeped in the doctrine of flexible maneuver and strategic retreat to preserve forces, were ordered to hold every inch of ground, regardless of the cost. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, found himself in a furious, often tearful standoff with the Führer. Bock, a loyal but pragmatic commander, saw the senseless slaughter and the increasing encirclement of his troops. He pleaded for permission to execute a tactical retreat to defensible winter lines. Hitler refused. This single strategic blunder cemented the second realization in the minds of the High Command. The Führer was no longer a reliable military commander. He was a political ideologue whose rigid adherence to willpower over professional military judgment was now actively costing German lives and, critically, Germany's strategic position. The aftermath saw the brutal purge of senior officers. Halder himself would be dismissed, along with Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, the army commander-in-chief. Hitler effectively took over personal command of the army. To the generals, this was an unmitigated disaster. They had lost control of the war. It was now being run by an ex-corporal obsessed with the map table and blind to the logistical reality of a global conflict. The war was lost not on the battlefield, but in the bunkers, when professional military expertise was replaced by amateur fiat.
Part 2. The Axis of Despair, 1942 to early 1943. If the winter of 1941-42 was a warning, the period from the summer of 1942 to the spring of 1943 was the confirmation of total strategic failure. It was during this period that the Second Front in North Africa collapsed and the single most crushing defeat in German history unfolded: Stalingrad. The Casablanca Declaration, the impossible price. The generals were fighting for tactical victories, while Hitler was losing the strategic war. The final seal of doom was perhaps affixed not by an enemy army, but by Allied diplomacy. In January 1943, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill met in Casablanca and issued a declaration that echoed throughout the halls of the Reich Chancellery: unconditional surrender. For the generals who harbored thoughts of a political putsch or a negotiated peace, men like General Ludwig Beck, who had resigned earlier, and increasingly figures like Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the declaration was a death knell. It meant that even if they managed to remove Hitler and his Nazi regime, the Allies would not treat with them. There was no military solution, no clever strategic maneuver that could achieve a peace without dishonor. The goal had shifted from achieving victory to simply avoiding annihilation. But the Allies had made it clear: only complete, unconditional capitulation would suffice. This was a psychological turning point. The fight was no longer about saving Germany's empire, nor even its pre-war borders. It was about delaying the inevitable, and in doing so, ensuring the total destruction of the German nation. Stalingrad, the death of the Sixth Army. No single event solidified the general sense of impending doom more than the catastrophe at Stalingrad. Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, was caught in the inferno. His pleas for permission to break out of the Soviet encirclement, known as Operation Uranus, were repeatedly, fanatically rejected by Hitler. The Führer insisted on a static defense, a symbolic stand that would prove the power of the German will. The reality was 250,000 men trapped, starving, and freezing. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the commander of Army Group Don and the last hope of relief, knew the Sixth Army could only be saved by a radical tactical withdrawal. Yet the orders from the Führer bunker were immutable. Hold. When the last shots of the battle faded in early February 1943, and Field Marshal Paulus, recently promoted by Hitler in a perverse attempt to ensure he would commit suicide rather than surrender, walked out of his headquarters into Soviet captivity, the Wehrmacht suffered a spiritual wound from which it would never recover. Generals, whose careers had been built on the principle of preserving the fighting capacity of the army, watched in horror as Hitler sacrificed an entire field army, one of the best Germany possessed, for a point of pride. The realization was stark and absolute. Hitler would sacrifice the entire army and Germany itself before admitting a strategic error. This defeat created a schism in the high command. Men like General Oberst, Jodl, and Field Marshal Keitel, the two most pliant, remained enthralled to Hitler's will. But a growing cadre of others, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, began to coalesce around a radical, treasonous idea. The Führer must be eliminated. The war was lost. The only remaining duty was to save the nation from its own leader. Part 3. The Iron Fist of the Allies, 1943 to 1944. The year 1943 marked the definitive loss of the initiative on all fronts. In the East, the last grand offensive, Operation Citadel, Kursk, ended in a devastating defeat, confirming the technological and numerical superiority of the Red Army. In the South, the Allies landed in Sicily and forced Italy out of the war, a political and strategic catastrophe. But the deepest anxiety for the generals commanding in the West lay not in ground battles, but in the skies. The day the Luftwaffe died, the air war. For generals like Field Marshal Kesselring in Italy or Field Marshal Gunther von Klug in the West, the most terrifying sign of defeat was the absence of the German Luftwaffe and the incessant presence of the Allied air forces. The strategic bombing campaign of the United States Air Forces and the British Royal Air Force was not just destroying German cities, it was systematically dismantling the nation's industrial heart, its transportation networks, and its war-making capacity. General of Fighters Adolf Galland, one of the most brilliant and decorated air commanders, had warned Hermann Göring, the Reich Marshal and head of the Luftwaffe, of the disaster years before. His warnings were ignored in favor of Göring's bombastic incompetence and Hitler's obsession with offensive, often unworkable weapons. The generals on the ground watched helplessly as Allied fighter bombers established total air superiority over all fronts. Every movement of troops, every concentration of armor, every supply train was a target. In Italy and Normandy, the German High Command found that they could no longer maneuver their forces effectively in daylight. The war had literally moved into a three-dimensional sphere that Germany had lost control of. The realization was a deeply humiliating one for an army that prized operational mobility. Germany had lost the war for industrial supremacy, and its consequences were being paid for in blood and bombed-out factories. The generals had mastered the doctrine of blitzkrieg, a fast-moving, combined arms war of maneuver. The Allies, particularly the Americans, had perfected the war of industrial and aerial dominance, a type of warfare Germany could never match. The Normandy Nightmare, Rommel's Despair. Field Marshal Rommel was placed in charge of the defense of the Western Front against the inevitable Allied invasion. His realization of defeat was perhaps the most acute and tragic of all the senior commanders. Rommel knew the Allies had total air superiority. He knew that the moment the invasion began, the armored reserves would be pulverized by Allied air power before they could reach the beaches. He argued passionately for placing his defenses right on the water's edge. He fought with Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall OB West, Commander-in-Chief West, over the deployment of the critical Panzer divisions. The argument itself encapsulated the final strategic failure. Rommel correctly understood the war was now decided by air power. Rundstedt still clung to the traditional doctrine of holding strategic armored reserves inland. Hitler, in his typical fashion, compromised, deploying some divisions inland and placing the authority to release them under his own distant command. When D-Day arrived, Rommel's greatest fear was realized. The initial defense failed, not because German soldiers didn't fight bravely, but because the German counterattack was strangled in its infancy. The panzers, stalled on the roads by Allied fighter bombers, arrived piecemeal, days late, or were simply destroyed en route. In the aftermath, Rommel became utterly convinced that the war was lost, not could be lost, but was lost. His conversations with his staff and his letters home speak of an unshakable conviction that Germany could no longer win, and that the only remaining course was to end the war and save the German people from total ruin. This realization led him to the conspiracy against Hitler. The plot of July 20th, 1944, was the ultimate manifestation of the general's despair. It was the moment a significant part of the High Command formally declared the war lost and saw the removal of the Führer. Part 4. The Final Delusions. Late 1944 to 1945. The failure of the July plot unleashed a wave of terror and repression that shattered the general staff. Thousands were arrested, tortured, and executed in the most humiliating ways. The professional military's last desperate attempt to reclaim control of the state failed, leaving the army utterly subservient to the Nazi regime's political police. The Purge and the Rise of Fanatics. After July 20th, Hitler lost all pretense of trust in the Wehrmacht. He promoted sycophants and fanatical Nazis, like Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, who prioritized execution for cowardice over tactical withdrawal. The last vestiges of the old Prussian General Staff tradition, the spirit of independent judgment and intellectual rigor, were extinguished. In the ensuing months, the remaining generals became less like military professionals and more like tragic figures trapped in a collapsing theatrical production. They knew the truth, but they were now powerless to act on it. The Battle of the Bulge, the last folly-driven gambit. In December 1944, Hitler launched his last major offensive, the Ardennes Offensive, or the Battle of the Bulge. For the generals who planned it, like Field Marshals Walter Model and Gerd von Rundstedt, the operation was a gamble of insane proportions. They knew Germany lacked the fuel, the air cover, and the men for such a massive armored attack. Rundstedt, the skeptical, old-school commander, famously told his staff, "This offensive has no objective other than the destruction of the German army." His words were prophetic. The attack failed. The short, sharp counterattack by the American forces, combined with the catastrophic expenditure of Germany's last operational reserves of tanks and fuel, sealed the fate of the Western Front. For the last remaining pragmatic generals, this battle was the absolute final sign. Any lingering hope for a stalemate in the West, a miracle weapon, or a split in the Allied coalition was extinguished by the sheer folly of the Ardennes gamble. The last strategic reserves were gone. Germany now faced the combined might of the Soviet and Western allies without the means to effectively oppose either. The Rhineland and the Vistula. No retreat, no hope. As 1945 dawned, the Soviet juggernaut, having recuperated and been massively resupplied, began its final crushing advance from the Vistula to the Oder. In the West, the Allies were closing in on the Rhine. The final realization for the generals was reduced to a horrifying calculation. How many German civilians could they save from the Red Army's vengeful advance by diverting forces to the east, while simultaneously attempting to slow the Western Allies in the hope of a quick Western-only surrender? Generals like Heinrizi on the Oder and Kesselring in the West were forced into this impossible ethical dilemma. They disobeyed Hitler's scorched earth orders, attempting to save infrastructure and civilian lives, a final, futile act of duty to the German people over the Nazi regime. They fought on, not for victory, but for a slightly less terrible form of defeat, often deliberately creating corridors for refugees to flee the Soviet advance. Conclusion: the long, cold death. The story of when Hitler's generals realized they had lost is not a single dramatic moment. It is a slow, agonizing descent from the high point of tactical genius to the abyss of strategic despair. The verdict of defeat was delivered in three distinct phases. 1. The operational failure, winter 1941. Halder and the logistics masters knew that Germany could not win the war of attrition against the vastness of the Soviet Union. The numbers simply did not add up. 2. The strategic calamity, winter 1942-43. The annihilation of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad proved that the Führer was a liability who would sacrifice the army for political dogma, and the Casablanca Declaration confirmed that a negotiated peace was impossible. 3. The industrial air defeat, 1943-1944. The total dominance of Allied air power and the subsequent collapse of Germany's industrial and logistics base demonstrated that the war was irrevocably lost not on the ground, but in the air and in the factories of America and Britain. By the time Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg walked into the Wolfschanze on July 20, 1944, the Wehrmacht had already lost the war in every quantifiable military sense. The remaining months were not a fight for victory, but a prolonged execution, a period of fanatical self-immolation dictated by a dictator who preferred the total ruin of his nation to the admission of his own failure. The generals of the Wehrmacht, the brilliant and often morally compromised architects of Hitler's early victories, were thus reduced to the ultimate tragic figures. Soldiers bound by an obsolete oath, watching their world burn, knowing with cold, professional certainty that the war had been lost piece by agonizing piece long before the final curtain fell. The real surrender, the spiritual one, occurred not in a ruined bunker, but in the heart of the German High Command years before the Allies crossed the Rhine. It was an unspoken truth, the heavy, chilling burden that Hitler's best commanders carried all the way to their own inevitable ends.